Okay, it's recording again. All right, so welcome everyone. For those who don't know, my name is Paul Geller, and I'm the Director of Global Studies and an Associate Professor of Sociology here at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. This is the second in a series of interdisciplinary events that Global Studies is organizing this year and next on the theme of the US in the globe and the global in the US, a view from the Southeast periphery. The first one was a month ago, and it was on globalization and COVID-19. The recording's available on our social media. I'll put that in the chat because that's where the recording for today's event will be as well. So today we have a roundtable focused directly on the US South and the globe with three super scholars and my colleague Tor Olsson from history, who's moderating. Just before we get started, I want to thank all the people who helped make this possible, even though we can't physically invite everybody here, and Zoom is the bane of our existence at the moment. But first of all, thanks to our sponsor, the Hayne Morris Endowment Fund, as well as a whole bunch of co-sponsors, the Center for Global Engagement, the Departments of Sociology, History, Political Science, Anthropology, the interdisciplinary programs in Africana, Asian, Latin American, and Caribbean and Middle East Studies. And the committee, which includes me and Tor, as well as Solange Munoz and Asafa Jalada and Tamara Gilbertson, and two undergrad club leaders, Lily Hardwick and Callista Boyd. After this, next semester, we're going to keep going. And in fact, we're going to have the flip side of today's program, hopefully in February, a roundtable focused on the global in the US South. So kind of the outward in instead of, and today is the inward out. Lastly, before I turn things over to Tor Olsson, I just give a brief shout out intro to him, that he is Associate Professor of History here at UT. As many of you know, he published Agrarian Crossings in 2017, which had the aim of dismantling the artificial boundaries dividing American and Latin American history. And he also has a really fascinating piece that's forthcoming in the Journal of Southern History on the South in the world since 1865, which explores some of the themes I think we're going to touch on today. So I'll turn the floor over to you.
Terrific. Thanks, Paul. Appreciate the introduction. And thanks to everyone joining us for this session. It's such a pleasure to have you all here. Big thanks to our three distinguished speakers, whom I'll introduce shortly. Let me also add a couple of thanks of individual people who really worked hard to make this happen. Paul, to be sure, Rachel Rui and Daisy Shen from the Center for Global Engagement at UT, and then Bernie Koprince and Mary Beckley in the History Department, all were essential for making this event come together. So as Paul mentioned, this is the first of two events that we're planning on the topic of the US South in the globe, the global in the US South. And I suppose we should start off with a question with who cares? So what? Why is this a topic that anyone should devote their attention to? Why are we here today? I will confess that I have my own selfish personal reason for being interested in this topic. I am from Sweden originally. I've lived in the US for a long time. I've lived in the American South for about 15 years. So I have this kind of personal vested interest in it. But my interest goes far beyond that, beyond this kind of selfish personal reason. I approach this question from the discipline of history. And not everyone in the room is a historian, but many of us are. And in the discipline of history, in the last 20 years or so, there's been a tremendous push within the discipline to think beyond the nation as the inherent container for writing all histories. There's been a tremendous push to grapple with people and ideas and institutions that don't neatly map onto national canvases. And I think this effort has been especially pronounced in the field of American history. And in the last 2 decades, there's been a surge of hundreds of dissertations, articles, and books that have tried to internationalize American history and expand the boundaries of that field beyond the actual territory of the United States. However, in this early rush to push these boundaries and internationalize American history, I feel like there's been a genuine neglect of the earlier tradition of regional history within the United States, the tradition that wrote about the American West, the Midwest, the Northeast, and particularly the American South. I got the distinct sense as I was reading the scholarship over many years that there was less emphasis on these regions as distinct actors within the kind of US and the world narrative, and that particularly the South was being left out of this. There was a real sort of reticence to talk about the South as a globally engaged place. And I think that that's not actually a coincidence. I think that there's deep reasons behind that. I think it stems from a stereotype, perhaps even a myth that goes back, that's certainly present today, but goes back many generations, this sort of stereotype that the South is this uniquely isolated region, that it's a place that's insulated from international currents, that the South is a world apart rather than a part of the world. So early transnational history didn't pay much attention to the region, but that's changing. And I think all of those assumptions that I just stated are being pretty wildly debunked and are being revealed to be quite false in many ways. So the impetus for me running this series of events and helping to plan them has been to invite scholars who are really at the cutting edge of thinking about the American South as a place that's deeply engaged with places not just in the US, but in the larger world around it. And I think that this scholarship, of which we're going to see 3 scholars who are really at the cutting edge of this field, are helping to rethink not just Southern history, but major fields such as African American history, environmental history, the history of capitalism, the history of gender and sexuality, among many other fields. So before we begin, I just want to make a couple of disclaimers before I introduce our guests. A couple of disclaimers. First, 2 disclaimers about what this panel is probably not going to be. I don't know exactly what's going to happen, but my sense is that it's probably not going to talk too much about the American South before the Civil War. Okay, mainly because of the folks that I invited are generally late 19th and 20th century scholars. That's not to say the South is not globally engaged before the Civil War. That's hardly the case. But because of the folks I invited, this is going to be a more sort of post-1865 conversation. Likewise, my second disclaimer is that this conversation is likely not going to be primarily about the world's impact on the South. As Paul mentioned, it's primarily about the South's impact on the world, though of course I'm not going to draw any neat boundaries. So for example, immigration, the arrival of foreign corporations to the South are not likely going to be major topics, mainly because I'm planning a second roundtable on these questions where we're going to prioritize those issues in particular. So that's probably not what's on the table for today, but we have much on the table that will be quite exciting. Enough of me clearing my throat. Let me first say just a quick word about the format of the panel, and then I'm going to introduce our 3 distinguished speakers. Okay, so today is going to be a true roundtable format. And what's going to happen is that instead of extended talks by each of these, I'm going to serve as moderator, and I'm going to ask a series of 3 questions, one at a time, of our 3 guests. They will each have 5 minutes to respond. I'll cut them off. I'll send you guys a private message, in fact, so watch the chat. I'll make sure that you're basically on track. Each of you have 5 minutes to respond to these 3 questions. And then after roughly 45 minutes of that, we're going to open it up to the larger group for a conversation and dialogue between the participants and, of course, everyone in the audience. So with that, let me introduce our 3 guests. Our first speaker, and we'll go in this order when I have you ask you all the questions too. Our first speaker is Nan Enstad. And Nan Enstad is a professor of community and environmental sociology at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. She's a specialist in the history of capitalism, and she's the author of several books. The most relevant of which is to this discussion is Cigarettes, Inc., An Intimate History of Corporate Imperialism, which was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2018 and was recently the winner of the Beveridge Prize from the American Historical Association. Thanks so much for being with us, Nan. Our second guest speaker is Brandon Byrd. And Brandon Byrd is an assistant professor of history at Vanderbilt University, just down the road from us. He is a specialist on African American internationalism in the post-Civil War era. And he is the author of a very recent book, The Black Republic, African Americans and the Fate of Haiti, which was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2019. It's a real pleasure to have you here, Brandon. Last but not least, our third speaker is Bart Elmore. And Bart is an associate professor of history at Ohio State University. Bart's work really focuses on the intersection between environmental history and the history of capitalism. He's the author of Citizen Coke, The Making of Coca-Cola Capitalism, which was published by W.W. Norton in 2015. And Bart is now putting finishing touches on 2 new books that will be coming out soon. One is a history of the Monsanto Company, and the other is a global ecological history of US Southern corporations in the 20th century. Thanks for joining us, Bart. So I'm going to kick us off by asking the first question of our 3 panelists. And we'll go in the order of Nan, Brandon, and Bart. And that question is, and I'll repeat it to make sure the audience can ponder this. The question is, what patterns, processes, or institutions has the South, or Southerners, exported beyond the US since the Civil War? What patterns, processes, and institutions has the South, or Southerners, exported beyond the United States since the Civil War? So I'll turn it over to Nan. You've got 5 minutes to answer that big question. Thanks.
Hey, cool. Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here. Real pleasure to be joining this conversation. I'm excited to hear both Bart and Brandon's responses, possibly a little more than I am to share my own. But I'm going to be drawing my comments out of the book that Tori mentioned that I just published recently. This is what it looks like. It's called Cigarettes, Inc. I started doing a project about cigarette factories in the South. I had lived in North Carolina and worked in North Carolina for a while, and I had noticed the cigarette factories, right? And so I started interviewing Black and white factory workers, retired factory workers. They were quite elderly. And as I was doing the archival research, I kept coming across China, descriptions of China, people going to China to grow tobacco, to sell tobacco. It wasn't my topic, but because, as Tori has said, you know, there's this turn to the international, and I many times just pushed it to the side, but I started to look at it. And what I ended up finding after many, many years, actually, was that a lot of the Southerners were in the cigarette industry were responsible for taking bright leaf tobacco and cigarettes themselves to China much earlier than I had expected, really the 1902 to the 1930s. They built an entire parallel industry there, from growing bright leaf tobacco, which had otherwise only grown in Southern Virginia and Northern North Carolina. Then it started to spread. They took that spread to China, and all the way through factories, distribution, advertising, the whole gambit. They built this industry, and hundreds of white Southerners went to China. So when I started looking at the tobacco, the Southerners, all the things that they exported, right? I realized they also exported Jim Crow segregation management styles. So when I say exported, I have to put a little bit of a qualifier around that, because they couldn't literally take Jim Crow and pick it up out of the South, right, and plomp it down into China, because Chinese people already had their own hierarchies, they had their own culture. But the white Southerners took these ideas and modified them in China. So one of the concepts that I developed to try to figure out how this happened was the Bright Leaf Network, which was a network of white collar, white guys who had wrested control over the bright leaf industry from African Americans, who were the ones coming out of slavery, who really knew how to grow and cure the tobacco. Through a violent process, white Southerners kind of grabbed control of this industry. And then when they took it overseas, they used the kinds of cultural and economic strategies that they used to build and perpetuate Jim Crow. They used those same strategies in China. And so one of those strategies was debt. They set up a program of growing bright leaf tobacco and getting Chinese farmers to grow this particular kind of tobacco, but they used a new system of debt in China to ensnare Chinese farmers in the same, not identical, but a similar kind of system as African Americans were ensnared in through sharecropping. It was different in China in ways I can explain later if you want. The other thing, though, that I found that was very interesting was the ideal of a Southern home. Grace Hale and others have talked about how the white Southern home was a place where people created segregation by sort of sanitizing race relations, employing white women, employing Black servants, and then managing that servitude in particular ways to create this ideal of the white home that was very much an extension of the rural economy, right? Well, white Southerners in the Tobacco Corporation also took that white Southern home. White women went to China, to Shanghai. They set up homes that became really central to the business culture. So one of the ways it connects back to Torre's comment is that here's this time that sometimes we look at and we say, oh, that's like Jim Crow, that's backward or primitive. Well, here it was right at the center of global capitalism. Right at the center of the modernizing economy as it was being expressed through the world. And these Southerners, by their innovations, right, their racist management style, their white supremacist management style, were shaping the apex of global capitalism. So I'll leave it with that. And the women in the family were part of it. So I'll leave it at that for now. Thanks.
Thanks, Nan. Brandon.
Man, that was great in so many ways. I'm gonna try to piggyback off that. Actually, so I'm from Raleigh, North Carolina, but my family's from Eastern North Carolina, down east. And I would say that myself, my sister, my brother are really the first generation that was not picking that tobacco that led to that global presence of white Southerners in the world. So many connections here. But let me try to piggyback off that by beginning with an anecdote. So in July 1915, a contingent of US Marines landed right outside of Port-au-Prince, Haiti. Now, those of y'all that know anything about the Marines know that they're the last contingent, last part of the US military to integrate. Of course, then they were all white. They were disproportionately white Southerners. And over the next 2 decades, in what was then the longest US military occupation, the United States, at the point of the bayonets, and the Marines proceeded to censor the Haitian press, to rewrite the Haitian Constitution, to reimpose forced labor in the Haitian countryside, resurrecting laws that had not been enforced since the French colonized Saint-Domingue, Haiti, in the late 18th century. The United States waged war on the Haitian peasantry, killed the lowest estimate is 13,000 Haitians over that period of time, probably much, much more than that. The United States mandated industrial education for Haitians, and they enforced racial segregation in Haitian cities. So that's a long-winded way of saying the United States, with a contingent of all white Marines, disproportionately white Southern Marines, basically made Haiti, what was then an independent Black nation state, look a lot like Birmingham, Alabama, or Atlanta, or name any place in the US South. All of this occupation occurred initially under the oversight of a man named Josephus Daniels. Josephus Daniels, here's another connection here, was born in Washington. Now, this is Little Washington, not Washington, DC, Little Washington, North Carolina. He was an arch segregationist, one of the most vocal Democrats. And by that, we know at that time, being a vocal Democrat and arch segregationist means promoting a Democratic Party that stood for white supremacy. And as the editor of the News and Observer, the leading paper in North Carolina out of Raleigh, he drummed up white hysteria over what he called Negro domination in Wilmington. he helped plan a coup in Wilmington in 1898. After that coup was successful in dismantling the biracial fusionist government in place in Wilmington at the time, turning what was then a Black majority city into a white majority city, Josephus Daniels bragged about what had happened. He was very proud of it. So he oversees that occupation. Now, I want to backtrack a little bit here. I don't want to oversimplify, right? Because Tori asked a very complex question that deserves a lot of nuance here. The South has exported many people. Many Southerners have gone abroad. Black diplomats, Black missionaries from the AME Church, from the National Baptist Convention, folks from Black institutions like Tuskegee, even Black soldiers in Spanish-American War, for example. Those Southerners have brought many different institutions and values, right? From music to the Black church, to notions of racial uplift, all of these things. But I think, and this I think goes to Nan's point as well, when we think about some of the most impactful ways in which the US South has shaped global affairs, I think we have to think about the ways it's projected US imperialism and state power abroad. And this is certainly the case in the Caribbean. It's certainly the case, even if we zoom in closer to specific sites in the Caribbean, to the island of Hispaniola and Haiti, Dominican Republic. Those occupations are carried out by folks like Josephus Daniels, by an overwhelmingly white Southern force of Marines.
Thanks, Brandon. Bart, I'd love to hear your 2 cents.
What a pleasure it is to be with all of you. It's a wonderful. I was in Knoxville. I said it's such a wonderful place, and thanks to Tori, thanks to Paul, and what a great honor it is to be alongside Brandon and Nan, 2 scholars whose work is very inspiring. I'll take a similar tack to Tori's take on this, which is to start by just saying how I came to write about the South. And I should say that my scholarship really focuses on Southern businesses and their environmental footprint, their environmental impact. I wrote a book on Coke, so focused mainly on Coca-Cola, but other firms as well. And that really grew out of where I came from. I grew up in Atlanta in the 1980s, 1990s. And when I went to school down by Hartsfield International Airport. And so every day I got to campus, I could smell jet fuel coming from the Delta Airlines hangars. And in fact, when I smell jet fuel today, it still reminds me of school. It's really weird. And to get to school, I passed the wonderful world of Coca-Cola on the way down to campus. I would go to by the CNN Center, headquartered there in downtown Atlanta. I would by Home Depot's, one of their major warehouses there in the middle of the city, and UPS's headquarters. For me, that was the South, growing up in that space in the 90s, with the Olympics arriving in 96, I thought, well, we're international, right? I mean, that's what we do. We of course we export things. This is our MO. And so when I went to grad school and was writing about Southern environmental history, which was a field that I think was really taking off in the late 1990s and early 2000s. For those of you who are not as familiar with environmental history, this field that really looks at the relationship between humans and the natural environment, both the ways in which humans have reshaped the natural environment, but also the ways nature has shaped the course of human events. That field began to really focus on the American South. And when I was in grad school, it was a lot about the South itself. The aperture of the investigative lens was very much centered on the Southern landscape itself. The South in that story was the site of degradation, right? It was the place where businesses came to extract resources. You can think of timber companies, and thinking of Burt Way's great works on longleaf pine forests that were laid waste in the South, or cotton and the soil erosion and the devastation caused by these industries, and even chemical firms that came to the South and then kind of changed that. For me, what I really was thinking about with my work was, well, wait a minute. It strikes me to precisely Tori's point here. The South is a space that also created institutions and businesses that had an outsized influence on the globe. And my work, I think, is trying to center that a little bit in a way to say, how is it that these firms that came from the South had such global reach and such a big impact on our global environment? And I'll just end by saying what has surprised me as I've kind of revisited this in this new book on looking at Southern economic history in the latter part of the 20th century and the environment is that if I had one thing I'd point to when it comes to economics and what we've exported from the South, it would be logistics. If you look at the companies that came out of the South, FedEx, Memphis, Tennessee, and there's a Southern reason why it's in Memphis, Tennessee. There's an environmental reason why it was headquartered in Memphis, Tennessee. But revolutionized the way we do. Think about all the Amazon shipments we get via air and air shipment today. They totally revolutionized that industry in so many ways. Walmart, the largest corporation in the world, based out of Arkansas, with their retail link, this advanced satellite system that allowed you to take things from China, get it all the way into some of the smallest towns in middle America, changed the game. Coca-Cola, think of a company that can get almost anywhere, right? And we can come back to this, but I just think when we think about the South and what it's exported, I would say that in terms of these distribution networks, these ways of organizing international exchange of commodities, the South has played an instrumental role in shaping the economy, the Amazon economy, if you will, that we all now in this pandemic are dependent upon. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thanks, Bart. Thanks to all of you for those provocative and fascinating answers to my first question. Let me move on to my second question for you all, which is, how have various groups of Southerners invoked the global in their struggles for or against social, economic, and political equality? How have various groups of Southerners invoked the globe, the world outside, in their struggles for or against social, economic, and political equality? We'll go in the same order.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to go back to that same context because it's the one that I know best, but I'm going to broaden it out a little bit. So when you think about these white Southerners who are traipsing around the globe for the British American Tobacco Company, they're in Shanghai, China, they're in Beijing, they're also in Japan, they're in South America, in a number of different countries in South America, they're in Mexico, they're in Canada, they've mobilized and are going around the world that way. And this connects to Bart's work. When I studied what the business culture was like in Shanghai, they were hanging out with other Southerners from other corporations like Standard Oil, like Coca-Cola, as early as the 20s and 30s, and they had a self-conscious Southern identity as imperialists. So in a certain way, what you could say is that they were building a Southern identity as a global identity, and we think of it as a regional identity, maybe even as from some perspectives, like up here in Wisconsin, people tend to think of it as a parochial identity. I lived in North Carolina, so I'm not doing that. But these folks were really seeing it as part of a global and imperial identity. They thought that they had something special to offer, not just British imperialism to set the terms for hierarchies in global capitalism. So that's a really important foundation. But I want to talk about, and I also want to say, just to connect to Bart's point, we associate this kind of global Southern identity with the Sun Belt, with the Waltons and the post-World War II period. So I really want to encourage us to see that as going back before World War II, well established in the 20s and 30s, and self-conscious for folks who were doing that. But I also want to really stress that these are the same decades that we see a new kind of globalization of Black culture, something that began in the 19th century, even the 18th century, with people traveling as speakers, as singers, as performers of various kinds. And one of the things that I track in my book is how another major export from the US South to China was jazz music, and Black musicians had an East Asian circuit that they traveled. So these white Southerners would go to cabarets in Shanghai, China, and there would be Black musicians playing for them and the dance halls. And so looking at what's going on with that kind of cosmopolitanism, if you can think of like one kind of white supremacist cosmopolitanism, what is this other kind of cosmopolitanism as people travel that East Asian circuit that gave Black performers a different vantage point in the world? They self-consciously saw themselves as cosmopolitan, as representatives of their race. They'd come back to the United States, they'd talk about those travels. It was covered across the Black press, which was really extensive in the early 20th century, Black newspapers, dozens of Black newspapers. And I found that interviewing these African-American elderly folks, like they knew about all of this. They didn't see themselves as part of a backwater. I met people who had met Duke Ellington, had hung out with him when he traveled through these little tobacco towns in the South. It was a part of the history that just was jaw-dropping for me. And they saw that as a claim to a kind of global significance that really stood in contrast with the way that they were treated in the South. And so I want to read a little quote by Duke Ellington. Or no, it's about Duke Ellington. Sorry, it's by Ralph Ellison, but it's about Duke Ellington coming and Ralph Ellison seeing him. And I always like to read this quote, not only because it's so great, but because I want more people to work on this. So Ralph Ellison is writing about being a kid in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and seeing Duke Ellington, who has traveled all over the world and is famous. And then Ellington and the great orchestra came to town, came with their uniforms, their sophistication, their skills, their golden horns, their flights of controlled and disciplined fantasy, came with their art, their special sound, came with Ivy Anderson and Ethel Waters singing and dazzling the eye with their highbrow beauty and with the richness and bright feminine flair of their costumes, their promising manners. They were news from the great wide world, an example and a goal. And I wish that all those who write so knowledgeably of Negro boys having no masculine figures with whom to identify would consider the long national and international career of Ellington and his band, the thousands of one-night stands played in the Black communities of this nation. Where in the white community, in any white community, could there have been found images and examples such as these? Who were so worldly? Who so elegant? Who so mockingly creative? Who so skilled at their given trade, and who treated the social limitations placed in their paths with greater disdain? I bet I'm up with my time now, but I guess I'll just say I could tell you a little bit more if you want later about exactly how the people that I interviewed were sort of materializing that experience of hearing these amazing musicians and dancing to them in the 1930s and 40s in their actual lives. I think it's a real impact of the globe, of marshaling something global. And it's only a half step to a real push for equality and freedom.
Yeah, so I love the for or against here because that's so crucial. It's so crucial to get at the complexities and the nuances here and the different populations of Southerners that we're talking about, right? So on the one hand, I guess we'll start with the against, right? The post-Civil War era, right? In local, national, and global terms, local, national, and transnational terms, there's a lot of similarities and there's a lot of back and forth, right? that generally speaking, this is a period where struggles for emancipation are generally speaking successful, but at the same time, there's a push again at the local, national, and international levels to try to build new regimes of white supremacy and racial capitalism, to try to build new forms of US empire and European empire that will guarantee markets for finished goods and guaranteed sources of raw materials, right? And that will do so in a way that guarantees easy labor pools of racialized people, right? So, and that's of course at the same time where you have a new forms of Jim Crow emerging in the U.S. South, right? And all of this has a sort of impacts ideologically, intellectually, right? So for white Southerners, when they think about this idea of the Negro problem, right? This idea that, well, African Americans cannot be part of a modern democratic society. They are fit for slavery, they're not fit for freedom. That ideologically is meant to fit the needs of that these new forms of racial capitalism. It's an ideology that is meant to justify the continued place of African Americans at the bottom of a social and economic hierarchy, right? And so when they think about that idea of the Negro problem, they think about it in international terms. They say, well, African Americans are not fit for freedom because Haitians are not fit for freedom, because Jamaicans are not fit for freedom, because Africans, entire continent is not fit for freedom, right? So it's the idea of the Negro problem is fundamentally about a regime of racial capitalism and is crafted in international terms, right? So that's that against. The struggle for liberation and freedom is similarly crafted in international and transnational terms, right? So in this period of Jim Crow and imperialism, Black Southerners, they are fundamentally drawing comparison between their experience and that of colonized Asia, the Caribbean, and Africa. They are thinking about liberation in transnational, international terms. So what that looks like is thinking in social, political, and religious terms, this idea of Ethiopianism, right? So Psalm 68:31, the princes will come out of Egypt, Ethiopia will stretch forth their hands to God. This idea that slavery and colonialism empire is just a blip on the historical time frame, and that Africa and African peoples across the world will have a renaissance of life. They will return to greatness. So that idea is fundamental to the experience of Black Southerners. And of course, that is very much an international idea. It's one that will provide the seeds of Pan-Africanism, certainly moving into the 20th century, the Pan-African movements of Du Bois, Garveyism, which has a strong foothold in the US South. All of that it's fundamentally transnational. It's rooted deeply in the experience of Black Southerners. It's rooted in their experience of the Black church. It's rooted in the similar struggles for land ownership that's part of plantation societies across the African diaspora. So it's very much a for or against, right? Both of these struggles in this era of Jim Crow and imperialism, that they're crafted in terms of not just what's happening in the South, but how that is also related to what's happening in Togo, to what's happening in Cuba, to what's happening in Haiti.
That's amazing. Nan and Brandon have covered so much ground. I think it's a tough act to follow. I think what, again, all of us kind of bringing different expertise to this. And for me, when I thought about this question, I thought about it in the sense of Southerners, especially white Southerners within multinational firms. Coca-Cola, of course, came to mind when I thought of this question. And when I thought about how various groups of Southerners, I thought about people like Robert Woodruff, Paul Austin, who were running the company in the 1960s, and how these guys who ran Coca-Cola would have thought about the global as civil rights agitation was kind of, as they saw it, agitation was taking off. And one of the interesting things that I think is, often talked about with Coca-Cola is this 1964 celebration for Dr. King in Atlanta, where Robert Woodruff and Paul Austin were praised really by a lot of people in the national press for getting white elites to come out for that celebration of of Dr. King receiving this prestigious prize. And it's true, Coca-Cola, did lobby to try and make sure that that event wasn't a failure, which it was going to be, which I think tells you a lot about white Southern businessmen at that time in the South. Gavin Wright has written a great book called Sharing the Prize, in which he talks about the fact that we may think that Southern businesses and Southern businessmen would have seen integration as something that, well, look, maybe this will expand, open up the economy and get this kind of stain off our back and that kind of thing. But the truth is, they kind of had to learn that integration was the best way for them to go forward. I mean, they went in kicking and screaming half the time to integration, thinking that it would ruin, their access to white clients and it would stain them in other ways. So, but Coke did do that. And, it's very clear that Paul Austin said to the folks that showed up, he said, look, we're an international company and the globe was on his mind. What's our reputation going to be if we fail at this? But it's a double-edged sword, because on the other hand, I think what this shows is that you see these moments where Coke, for example, does this in '64, and wow, they were changing because of the globe. But then in '68, the last speech that Dr. King gives, the mountaintop speech in Memphis, Tennessee, to sanitation workers, he calls for a boycott of Coca-Cola, precisely because Coca-Cola continues to practice discrimination in its hiring and having kind of these racialized Southern norms embedded in its culture. And that continues into the 1990s. It wasn't really until 1997 when there was a massive court case brought, in a federal court case that ultimately was decided in 2000. It was the largest class action settlement in US history related to a racial discrimination case. And it was against Coke, and they were required to create an advisory panel to try and come in and change the culture of the company and all this. So this is 90s and into the 2000s. And I think what it shows is kind of something that Nan had mentioned earlier about the fact that these Southern norms coexist just fine within these huge global corporations. And they do for a very long time. I mean, even after the Civil Rights Act of '64 and '65, we see these kind of racial customs within the firm. And so I'll end by just saying this, I think what's really interesting is that multinational firms that are headquartered in the South embrace the globe when it's useful to them, but they also reject the globe when it's not useful to them. Great example is, again, Coke. They love to talk about how their distribution network is everywhere, that you can get a Coca-Cola into the smallest little hamlet, whatever location around the world. But the moment you start talking about their ingredients and how it's sourced, well, where does the coca leave? Well, Coca-Cola. Well, where does coca come from? Well, no, we don't sort. Well, we don't have coca. Well, you do have coca in your drink, and they still have coca leaves in their drink, but they refuse to talk about the connection to Peruvian Andean farmers who produce that ingredient, or the cola nut, which comes from West Africa, right? Especially during the Jim Crow era, right? So I think it's interesting the ways in which Southern firms, depending on the scenario, they embrace the globe. We're this global company, spreading love around the world. At the same time that, when they think about the sourcing of things that go into their products, there's this kind of rejection of the globe. Let's not think about the people who actually make the stuff that go into our products. I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much to all three of you. It's really, really fascinating stuff. So I've got one last question for the gang before we throw this open to a broader conversation. And bear with me, this one's slightly longer. Have international connections either reinforced or challenged the South's peculiar characteristics of the post-Civil War era? And in terms of peculiar characteristics, I mean things like plantation agriculture, legally mandated racial segregation, evangelical religious devotion, one-party politics, among others. I'll repeat that. Have international connections either reinforced or challenged the South's peculiar characteristics of the post-Civil War era? Or put in other words, has the global engagement reinforced, has it underscored Southern exceptionalism and its unique regional identity, or has it eroded it? I'd love to hear what you all think.
Well, when I read this question, I had to laugh because I thought, well, the best work I can think of to answer this question with is actually Tore Olsson's book. So I hope that you will slide in some of your, I'm not going to presume to try to speak what your intervention is, but it's a really amazing one. I love your book so much, so I hope that you will bring that in the discussion. I'm going to deconstruct the question. I tried not to give in to this impulse, but then I saw that a friend, it's not a well-known fact about me that I started out working first with an intellectual historian at University of Minnesota, David W. Noble, but then I saw that one of my graduate student friends, who was also an advisee of David's, is here, Mark Hulsether. So that like tipped me over into messing with the question instead of answering it. So I want to talk about this word peculiar, and that is often used about Southern institutions, and especially focusing on plantation agriculture. And this, there are certainly regional differences in the United States, but especially when we talk about Southern regional differences, they are so mired in America's racial redemption project since the Civil Rights Movement that it's difficult to see them well. And we're still working within the discipline of history to get past some of the ways that the historical narrative has been used to neutralize the Civil Rights Movement and Black power. So thinking about a global perspective can help with this. I think Gavin Wright, I love Gavin Wright's work. He talked about, and really influenced me, talked about the US South as isolated from the rest of the development of the country because of the low rural wage after the Civil War ended. Because the rural wage was, agricultural wage was depressed, immigrants didn't flow to the South of the United States the way they did to the Northeast cities and to the eastern coast of South America. So industrialization didn't develop in the same way in the South. And that's a really important context. Plantation agriculture remained viable, whether it be done in gang labor or in sharecropping, and it was done in both, as I'm learning more about right now in my new project. But this casts the South as backward and primitive, not as modern as the North, and it tips into things that both of the other panelists have talked about. It's used to pose the North as not as racist as the South, as the more modern part of the United States, and capable of redeeming the national story in the 1960s because the North is not mired in the same social structure of segregation. Clearly a mistake, right? Clearly we have seen through the way that the last decades have gone, that the North is, if anything, more segregated in some ways than the South. The Great Migration likewise posed as the modernization of African Americans, leaving the South for the modern industrial North, still the dominant line of US history repeated over and over in textbooks. But if we see the South as a different model of modernity, then all of a sudden it's very much in line with US activities in other countries, as the United States, as Bart has delineated already, invests in plantation agriculture elsewhere in the world, as well as in the United States South. In the South, the low tax, low social services system that we now associate with structural adjustment and neoliberalism of the post-World War II era was in place in the Jim Crow era. And so if anything, we should see that as a harbinger of what's coming rather than as peculiar, or when we say peculiar, there's like this primitivism that's kind of lurking in that. So the South is not peculiar in the broader context of the US and the world. It was always a critical aspect of US history, not a backwater. I don't think Tore actually meant all this by it, but just because these associations come so quickly. So how can we talk about, for example, the United States abiding an increasing investment in plantation agriculture through the 20th and 21st century, rather than the South's regressive commitment to plantation agriculture, right? We make it seem like the plantation was something of the past that it couldn't get over, rather than seeing that this investment is actually increasing. And sad to say, in Eastern North Carolina, as Brandon no doubt knows, the tobacco corporations are now starting a new generation of captive labor around tobacco. So if you think about what is a plantation, I want to first be sensitive to African American history and a particular trauma of speaking about plantations. It's important not to be glib. Slavery is not a metaphor, and so what I'm saying is that a definition of a plantation that's not only tied to systems of African slavery as one terrible iteration, but can speak to the dominant form of agriculture in the United States and its corporate structure. And if we think about what is a plantation, one of its characteristics is monoculture, another is a captive labor force in some way. African slavery was one way, but there are many other ways. And then the third thing is the direction of profits away from the community that supports and reproduces the labor. So the people are working all the time, but they're not reaping the benefits of the labor. We have plantations all over the United States now, including in California and Wisconsin, where I am, animal agriculture, migrant labor from Mexico and Central America. Sonny Perdue just told family farmers in Wisconsin that the family farm is over. What's replacing it? We don't name it. So at any rate, that's my kind of deconstruction of saying the South shouldn't be seen as separate. It should be seen as, if anything, like a laboratory for creating new systems of oppression and captive labor.
It'd be hard to follow up on that. So I'm going to return to where I started with the U.S. occupation of Haiti. And in particular highlights one Black Southerner's perception, critique, opposition to that occupation. That's James Weldon Johnson. So James Weldon Johnson, I'm sure many of y'all know him. He is one of the most influential leaders of the NAACP in the early 20th century. He is born in Jacksonville, Florida, to Bahamian immigrants. He's born and raised there. He has his formative years in the U.S. South, attending college in Atlanta, teaching at Fisk. Also as part of the Great Migration, he also has formative years in New York as well. But it is certainly fits within the mold of a Black South that is not only geographic, but also there's a mental aspect of the global South that certainly transcends geographic boundaries, right? So James Weldon Johnson, as part of the NAACP, goes to Haiti in 1920, right? He's leading a investigation of conditions in Haiti, which had been, it was well known, the damages that the occupation was doing to Haitians, well known amongst white leftists in the US, well known amongst African Americans, in large part due to the way that Haitian nationalists had advertised what was happening. But at the same time, many of the excesses of the occupation were still being obscured by men like Josephus Daniels, right? So James Weldon Johnson goes to investigate conditions there. And in Haiti, he sees a number of the things that I mentioned at the very outset, right? He sees the coerced labor, and this is of course at the same time as convict leasing in the US South, right? While the NAACP is waging a campaign against that. So he sees that, notes those similarities, right? Of course, he notes the censorship, the inability of Haitians to speak freely about their oppressions, which is very much a reality for African Americans. He notes the wanton violence that faces Haitians. He notes the segregation. All these things bear very clear similarities to his own experience in the United States, in particular to his upbringing in Florida and the US South, right? One thing stands out in particular too. In the segregated cities of Haiti and Port-au-Prince, he notes that, and he says this is a rough paraphrase, that Marines who bring their wives there, bring their families there, who could have never afforded a single Black servant in the United States, would have a whole household full of Haitian servants, slaves, his words, right? And he says that this is indicative of the ways that Americans have carried American hatred to Haiti. So I use that as a way to say, and this is a way to sort of, not to engage in, some deconstruction of the question here, but a way to sort of flip it a bit. What Johnson is doing there is very indicative of what many African Americans, what many Black Southerners in particular, and most African Americans at this time are Black Southerners, of course, right? It's indicative of what they were doing and what they did through their transnational engagement, right? Which was in many ways to dispel myths of American exceptionalism. And of course, it's American exceptionalism with a sort of Malcolm X-ian idea of America of being all the South, everything below the Canadian border to be in the South, right? So to dispel myths of that exceptionalism, to say that all of the worst aspects, or the characteristic aspects, right? Racial segregation, racial capitalism, all these things that we are told are supposedly aberrant aspects of a democratic society, that they're really fundamental parts of it. And not only are they fundamental parts of it, but they're also fundamental parts of a global order. They're fundamental parts of a global order that is shaped by the US and by the US South's role in the world, right? So all that's to say is that this global engagement sharpened a critique of the United States and the US South, its institutions, its values, and it really led to a real thinking about a different way of doing things and a different way of building society.
Wow. Again, tough to follow. And I think it covered a lot of ground. One of the things that struck me when I read this question is that I said, this is one of the most important things I think we have to do as people, as scholars of Southern history, which is confront this question because of the political power it holds. And I know there are elections just happened and politics are maybe on everyone's mind, but I think one of the powerful myths in the American mind and kind of American mythology, if you will, today is this idea that the South's kind of retrograde social institutions were a product of its economic backwardness. And when you teach business history of the South, that doesn't include CNN, that doesn't include Bank of America in Charlotte, doesn't include Exxon or these massive cigarette companies that have these huge global impacts. That's the kind of message you can walk away from as a high school student or a regular person reading history. And you can say, well, with economic progress comes social justice, right? And I think we as scholars know that's obviously incorrect, but I do think the stories we tell about the South, what we include and what we don't include, the stories about multinational businesses that we don't tell, that are on the rise. If you make the point that the largest corporation in the world is going to be emerging at the same time as Jim Crow segregation is taking place, that teaches something. That teaches something profound about this myth that just provide jobs, just provide industry, and all things will be better, which I think is a powerful message in the political sphere today, one that holds sway. And if I were to look at the question, the thing that I would want to also make sure we're clear on is the international connections in this question suggest that maybe there weren't as many before the Civil War. And when I teach the history of American capitalism, I draw extensively on Ed Baptist and Sven Beckert, whoever it is, that's talking about the very foundation of our industrial economy, the textile industry, which emerged in this moment where cotton was the fuel. And even our financial system, I think Baptist showed it well, the Bank of the United States in the early 19th century, what something like a third of all the assets of the bank were backed ultimately by human bodies. There were, people enslaved in the South. So the South has always been global, right? And it's always been not only just a part of the global economy, it has been, the fuel. It has created the institutions that have made this global economic system we live in today possible. telling that story alongside the story of Jim Crow, alongside the story of inhuman bondage, that is powerful work that I think we're doing as Southern historians now, because I do think that it has real world implications for political discussions today. Meaningful things can be done by teaching that history. And I'll just mention that based on a conversation I had with a friend, who during this election cycle said, I just wish we could lop off the South, And I remember just thinking as a historian, how easy that is to do for somebody who's not thinking about it historically. You just lop it off, and let it go. And without understanding its embeddedness in everything that runs the world we live in today. And so, it was just a great question to ask, because it got me to think about why we do what we do. Because I do think telling history the right way and working on rewriting Southern history can have real world implications. So I'll leave it there.
Terrific. Well, at this point, I want to turn and invite many of the other folks in the room into the conversation as well. So the way that I want to do this, to get a little, because the Zoom setting is weird, and I want to try to, manage it in some sort of way to make it work more smoothly. What I'm going to ask is that if you have a question, I ask that you open your chat window and simply type a question mark. If you type a question mark in the chat, that will put you in line to ask a question of all three of the panelists, one particular panelist, and then we'll have a sort of queue set up where people can take turns, and we'll try to manage this in a sort of democratic way. I'll say, if you find that you really want to interject something after someone's answered a question, then feel free to jump in just with a short comment. You don't need permission, just jump in and say your comment or a short question. But if you have a substantial question for the panelists or for anyone, then please just type a question mark in the chat box, and we'll have a line established in that way. So Paul has the very first question. Please, Paul, kick it off. People keep putting your question marks in the line though, right, as we're talking, and we'll call on you next. Okay.
Well, thanks. That was really awesome, and I really enjoyed it a lot. And since I work on Indonesia, and I'm not a historian, but I do very historical work in my work on natural resources. So I was struck by the comments about the spread of plantations is very much on the mind. And I heard all the specificities about racism and the export of Jim Crow and the Haiti story, and I still was wondering, how much are we specifically talking about the region, because it sounds so familiar in other contexts as well. So that's one question, and the other is, what about now? So we talked about, like, okay, this existed way in the past. It existed pre-Civil War. It existed in the teens and 20s. And now we're moving into a period where many folks have been saying for quite some time that the US power is potentially in decline. There are other competitors globally. What does this mean for everything you've been saying about the export of and import of things to and from the US South? I have like a dozen other questions, but I'll leave it there.
I don't see Brandon or Bart jumping to the mic. Do either of you want to start? Brandon, do you want to?
Was that for me?
It's for anybody.
Yeah, Paul, would you mind clarifying a bit? I'm not sure if I.
Well, I guess I'm wondering, I'm thinking, in places like Indonesia, where Dutch colonialism also imposed a racial order, where what you described about the wives of the Marines coming in and having a better life with lots of Haitian slaves in their household when they're in Haiti than they could afford in the US South, I think is parallel to what folks like Stoller have found in the Netherlands East Indies, that when the Dutch brought their wives over in the late colonial period, because at first just the men went, that they experienced the same, and that actually it was the beginnings of the creation of a racialized capitalism that had already existed. Actually, in that case, the racialized component was quite different when the men went by themselves, because they mixed more with local populations than they did after white Dutch wives joined them there. So that's why I was wondering sort of how particular is this to the South? And some of the stories that each of you were saying, I was like, well, that's global capitalism. What's so Southern about that? Why is this regionally specific? And then the other question was more about, where do you see this going post Amazon, if we can, or post US power, or, where is it going in the mid 21st century?
Oh, I agree with you 100%.
Yeah, and I might add something about kind of the latter part of the question, which especially as this declension story of the United States and its power. One of the interesting things to think about, going back to one of Tori's questions about the globe and, invoking the globe, Southerners invoking the globe, is that companies like Walmart, for example, based in Arkansas, are having to do the opposite. They're invoking like made in America, precisely because of this, it's not good to be like, we're this global company getting all of our stuff from China. Wait a minute, especially where we are in Arkansas and especially middle America. This is not a message that sells. So again, I think that for and against, or I forget where we were in the conversation about that, but the ways in which these multinationals simultaneously want to embrace the fact that they're global, and then now in this moment are saying, no, we're not that kind of global. We're actually local. I'm definitely, seeing that messaging today as a result of the political transformations we're seeing globally.
I guess, I asked that question a lot, Paul, as I was working on my book, because I read Stoller and I was like, wow, I'm seeing a lot of the same kinds of things. But interestingly, the British Empire has gotten a lot of attention, the Dutch Empire. Nobody really had thought that the US South was playing a part in this particular moment of empire, right? The United States, except in the Philippines, right, or in Puerto Rico, where the United States had a colony. So how we define US empire shifts if we start looking at where businesses are going as early as 1880s, 1890s. And that's not exactly where the field of US history has been. It's been like US becomes an imperial power, and it tends to look at a pretty narrow range of countries. Latin Americanists accepted, right? Because Latin Americanists start looking at invasions and ideas, and United Fruit is really important. So a lot of the people that I read as I was working on this for a model were Latin Americanists. But I think it's important to see that the patterns of global capitalism that were being created weren't just being created by the British Empire. So within Shanghai, you see this interaction between Brits. I mean, it's the British American Tobacco Company, and it is one of the first global or the first multinational corporations in the world. And you see this interaction between British and American, but an American in this case is Southern. And so for me, and I really point to the work of Betsy Esch on this count, where she has a book about forward management and how these management styles that were taken all over the world, and this isn't particularly Southern, right, but it is particularly American, and looking at how Ford pioneered these management styles that were rooted in white supremacy, and that became part of the kind of the pattern of global capitalism. And my experience is when I talk to people who are based in Stoller, they're really thinking about European empire as setting the terms for that. So that feels really important to me. And it also feels really important to say, if we are going to talk about global capitalism, that we see that it has a texture and a culture and a history, and we don't just see it as economic forces that lead naturally to structures, right? That these structures are cultural. A lot of what we've been saying here is that there's all these ideologies and myths that get tied into this, even that make it very complicated to talk about the South, right? Or the global. And I think part of doing that work is to historicize that and to give it a face, to give it a culture. I don't have anything to say about the present or future, though. I don't know anything about those things.
We've got a question from Tim Gill. Tim, please.
Hey, how are you doing? Really enjoyed the questions and what you had to say. It was super fascinating. My own research is on sort of U.S. empire in Venezuela and contemporary world democracy assistance and stuff like this. So, but yeah, it's super fascinating to hear about the American South. I'm from Ohio, up in Cleveland. Hope you're enjoying Ohio, Bart. And but I've been down in the South since 2009. So becoming more familiar and with Coca-Cola, and was in Georgia too and whatnot. Here in your talk, I was thinking about the cigarettes and Coca-Cola. I've done a little bit of travel, even though my stuff is in Latin America. I've done a little bit of traveling in Eastern Europe. My wife is from over there, and so when I've traveled around there, I've been struck by the amount of cigarette smoking, and I've heard that that's a place where there's a lot of marketing in the post-communist Eastern Europe. And simultaneous is very, very interesting, because like there's a couple of places over there, like Albania, for instance, is like one of few countries in the world that doesn't have a McDonald's. They have like a mock McDonald's, but it's like not McDonald's. And I think Serbia just opened their first McDonald's, but you know, in Ukraine, there was a McDonald's and it was like so popular, but it kind of had like a different, my understanding was that it wasn't seen as this like, for lack of a better word, like low class environment. In Ukraine, it was seen as like this cosmopolitan type of place. So I was just really fascinated by just, you know, this part of the world, and, you know, that has kind of opened up and formerly was against sort of Western influence. Anyway, I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on sort of like the American South and Eastern Europe and the post-socialist world, be it cigarettes, Coca-Cola, or otherwise. Thank you.
And you want to start? Eastern Europe, I don't know. It's an interesting question. I think, I mean, one thing that's very clear with Coke is that you can see it just like with cigarettes, actually, that once health concerns reached a certain level with soft drinks in the United States and concerns about obesity, the company very clearly started figuring out, okay, what markets can we target where we can maybe avoid the resistance we're facing here. You know, between 2004 and 2014, I think soft drink consumption in the United States dropped by about 20%. And, you know, they needed to make up that market. And much like we see in the tobacco story, making up that market means going overseas in a lot of cases. So, you know, for example, I look at their 10Ks, I read a lot of their financial stuff, even today. You just never escape, by the way, when you write about a company, you're just constantly reading about them. And even though you want to move on to Monsanto or something else, and, you know, you'll see it. It'll say, look, in the United States, Diet Coke sales through the roof. And we're making people healthy and it's low calorie. And if you look in the fine print, it says, but in India, you know, double-digit growth and full calorie Sprite and Coca-Cola, because the metrics have to add up, right? You've still got to show that those brands are doing well. So, you know, Eastern Europe wasn't necessarily has not necessarily been the target. A lot of it has been in India, parts of Northern Africa. They're looking for places where they just have lower per capita consumption of Coke, but I do think there's similarities there. One other thing I'll say is, you know, the thing that I've really realized in the second iteration of writing about Coke for this new book that I'm writing is that what might be slightly unique about what's happening in the South is a lot of these businesses, whether it's Walmart, whether it's Coca-Cola, they engage in a kind of country capitalism. Like what they're interested in doing, if you go back to their records, is servicing the countryside, getting things out into rural areas. Look at Walmart. It was a great example. They literally didn't open stores in towns unless they were of a certain small size. They wanted the size to be about 5,000, 6,000 people, which Target and all these other retail companies thought was insane. But in Arkansas that made sense. Maybe you can put it here, and with interstate highways, people will drive to our stores, which by the way creates this huge environmental footprint because people are driving long distances to get to these big box Walmarts. But the point here is that whether it's Coke, whether it's Walmart, whether it's FedEx, because FedEx was doing the same thing. They were trying to service smaller markets where larger airlines weren't coming in to drop off air shipments. So they were going to like smaller little towns and places. So similar logic. And I think there's something about the South that explains why you see the spread, whether it's Eastern Europe, whether it goes to India, whether it goes to, that businesses in these environments where they need to spread, that is part of their model, right? It is in their DNA if they're going to survive. Candler's not going to make it if he just sits in Atlanta, but because he has that railroad network, it's all about getting it out into these little towns and little communities. There's something about that kind of, now this sounds terrible, but cancerous, right? It's kind of a cancerous growth kind of model for spread, which I think is very, it's not, again, going back to Paul's question, is this unique to the South? You certainly can see it in other places, but there's something about that Southern landscape and the rural character of the surrounding areas around the South of these big cities, that there might be something there that explains why it can spread so easily, whether it's Eastern Europe or wherever else. So something I'm playing with in this new project for sure.
Nan, you have a question for Brandon. I encourage you to ask.
Yeah, so I just, as we've been talking about this, and this is maybe too general to even get your hands around, but, well, I bet you can, but I guess what I'm kind of reaching for is, like, when I was listening to you talk about the ways that James Weldon Johnson was sort of intervening in Haiti, and also earlier when you were talking about, or maybe that was at the same point, I'm sorry if I've kind of scrambled it, the kind of Garvey was super popular in the South, and that there's basically this creation of kind of a Pan-African ideology really early. How useful is it to be thinking about the South in relationship to this kind of African-American foreign policy oriented thought and intellectual history? And are folks pretty much resisting identifying as Southerners? I think when I wrote my book, I tried to resist allowing Southerner to mean white, but it seems that there is some sense in the South that Southerner is more owned by white people. So I'm just kind of curious how much you find a regional analysis to be useful in thinking about Black internationalism, or if the terms are too tainted by their history.
Yeah, that's such a good question. It's one that that I'm really trying to grapple with more now. So in the first book, I didn't really have a regional, an explicit regional analysis per se. I think in large part, well, I won't really try to explain why that was, but it just there wasn't really an explicit regional analysis, right? Even though I was grappling with, given the time period that I'm working in, late 19th, early 20th century, right? A large percentage of my historical actor subjects were Southerners, from very well known Booker T. Washington, from ordinary editors in the U.S. South to run-of-the-mill folks that folks haven't heard of. But I'm trying to grapple with a lot more where I'm going. So right now, one of the projects I'm working on is what I'm envisioning as a grassroots and transnational history of the post-emancipation United States, intellectual history, that really grapples with the visions of freedom espoused by formerly enslaved people in particular. So I think in many ways, where I'm at right now is in thinking about how that what we may think of as a regional analysis is really how to put it, in many ways, it's more of a structural analysis, right? That in many ways, there's nothing, and maybe this gets back to like Paul's point, there's nothing, there's nothing essential, like we don't want to essentialize the region, right? It's not that it is a birth in Florida or birth in North Carolina, et cetera, that does something or dictates a certain type of politics for somebody like James Weldon Johnson, right? But it's an experience of the structures that develop out of slavery that are in the U.S. South, but that are also in places like Haiti, that are in Jamaica, right? That really inform those politics. And so what I'm interested in right now is how Black Southerners and African Americans, their understandings of freedom, how they are fundamentally shaped by their experience of that structural oppression that is of the South, but is also, and from their understanding, is also of the African diaspora, and especially of other areas in the post-emancipation Americas. So how and why they are drawing an analysis based on their own experience, but also based upon what they see as the similarities between other formerly enslaved people, right? And so that sounds a little broad and, in specific, but for instance, let me try to make that more specific, right? So even in my own family, right? So this is on my maternal side, maternal side North Carolina, maternal side Alabama, right? Who had a large family, extended family compound outside of Birmingham, right? Looks very similar to the Lakou in Haiti, for example, right? And these folks know that, right? And so that deserves not necessarily a regional analysis, but demands a sort of structural analysis that identifies how these different ideas and these different institutions that are built upon an understanding of freedom, how they develop in parallel fashions and forms, right? And how they move across these spaces.
Very cool. That's awesome.
Is there one last short question that anyone has?
While we wait, Tori, I might mention something that has come to mind as we've just been talking. I think the other thing that is problematic about the Southerner is that we haven't talked a lot about migration, like the fact that the South is constantly in motion. And to plug a new book that's coming out, my advisor, Ed Ayers' new book called Southern Journeys just came out yesterday, I think. And he's actually giving a talk right now on that book. And it's about, he uses GIS maps, as only Ed would, being a pioneer in digital history, to show this kind of inflow and outflow, the boundaries of the South as being permeable by the people that cross it, and how much that flow changes over time. And so by talking about the South, as the static place, it completely mutes all of that. And so I'll see if I can find the link and I'll post it to the chat so that he can, if people are interested in that new book, I think it's really a beautiful book showing that flux of Southerners, whatever they are, right, coming from all over the world.
Yeah, that's such a huge intervention, Bart. One question that sort of I think has permeated a lot of our responses here is, where is the South, right? Even and then you alluded back to Garveyism, right? Of course, its base is in Harlem, right? But those are all Afro-Caribbean folks, right? Which we want to think about a greater South, right? Is where's Louisiana, where's Charleston, where's Baltimore, right? But those are Afro-Caribbean people. Those are Black Southern migrants, right? The folks that carry on Garvey's message, after he's deported, right? A good friend Ashley Farmer's writing what's going to be just a great biography of Queen Mother Audley Moore, right? Born in Louisiana, So where's the South, right? We can't limit it geographically. There's a psychological aspect to this. There's a political aspect to this. There's a cultural aspect to it.
So I am so glad that I invited you three to come, because this has been such an amazing and eye-opening conversation. Even though I've read a lot of books on this topic at this point, I learned so many things from this discussion, and you guys really blew my mind. And hopefully I can speak for others in the audience as well. But we're just about out of time. I know Zoom fatigue is a very real thing. I'm not going to hold you guys here any longer. Thanks everyone for coming and participating. And thanks especially to Bart, Nan, and Brandon for such an incredible conversation. It's really been a thrill. So I bid you all farewell. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll have another one of these sessions, probably in February, about the sort of flip side where we get to delve into these questions more. Please join us.
Thanks, everybody.
See you, man.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much for coming.